What's up, Rick? What are we gonna do? I sighed languidly, folded the letter back up, and put it in the envelope. I tried to return it to Leslie, who was looking at me with hope and longing. It's your letter, Rick, not mine. I immediately tossed it unceremoniously onto the kitchen table and met her hard gaze. She'd barely begun a second glass of wine, and I knew it wasn't the Moscato that was making her eyelids heavy. The letter probably weighed only an ounce or so, but it felt like more than a ton. After all, it contained everything that had accumulated in our 20-plus years together. Marcy summarized every significant or notable event in our history: our wedding, our two grown and successful children, all the trials and difficulties, all the dreams and hopes for us and our family, boiling them down to the words, "Either take me back or don't." Although I disagreed with their choices and lifestyle, what Vincent and Leslie were doing seemed more honorable than what Marcy had just done to me. I was so angry that everything inside me was shaking. I'm not a screamer, so some might interpret that as calm. In combat, many people seem calm, including me, though I'm not. But when you're in charge of other people's lives, you don't have the ability to lose control of yourself. I stood up, uncorked the wine, took both glasses, poured the rest of the wine into the sink, and returned to my chair. Leslie, nothing good is going to happen for me, for you and for me right now. I need to process this information, and I just can't do it right now. I'd like, if your and Vincent's offer still stands, to have dinner with you and discuss things further sometime soon. But right now, I'd like you to answer a few quick questions, if you agree. She only nodded her head slowly, keeping her eyes on me. I had slipped into battle command mode, and she was very uncomfortable. Have you spoken or interacted with Marcy since she left on a business trip a couple days ago? No. She shook her head slowly. Were you supposed to contact her to discuss the results of that meeting with her? Yes. Cautiously, she nodded her head. And how is that supposed to happen? By email. Can I ask you to hold off on that? I know we don't know each other very well, and you don't owe me anything, but I'm the kind of person who needs time to think things through before making decisions of this nature, and I'm afraid the anger I'm feeling right now will boil over if I don't have time. I don't want to respond to her calls and say things I can't take back. I was getting emotional, and it was making me angry. Pull yourself together, Rick. So I'm asking you for one favor. Please don't contact her or react in any way at all to her appeals. I'm only asking for a week so I can calm down. Sure, Rick, I can do that. Our plans aren't that time-sensitive anyway. Tell me, Les, have you talked at all about how she expects me to react to this letter? A little, but remember, I thought she was going to talk to you before she left. She realized you'd be angry, but would eventually take her offer to be with me. She thought that eventually you'd figure it out, and you'd both move on with your lives. Whose idea was Moscato Les's? It was hers. She said it was a favorite wine the two of you drank on the back patio after a long day. She said it's one of her favorite moments in her marriage. It's when she feels close to you. She just confirmed to me that the two of them planned this in minute detail. It wasn't a random decision. Marcy had coldly and calculatingly devised a plan that could have ended our marriage, and it pissed me off that I didn't see it coming. I needed to think about it. I stood up, giving the universal meeting over sign, and handed her the bottle of wine. Thank you for stopping by, Leslie. I'm serious about the dinner request. We can go out if you prefer, and I'll buy, just give me a week or so. Sure, Rick. I hope I haven't offended you, and you don't seem to be the type to talk about personal things, but please keep Vincent and my lifestyle to yourself. Of course, Leslie. And please don't think I'm judging you. If my marriage wasn't on the line, I'd be interested in learning more about your lifestyle. Maybe someday. Good night, Les. And I escorted her out the door. Only then did I realize I was calling her the familiar shortened version of her own name. Perhaps because at that moment I felt more comfortable with her than with my own wife. I wondered if I could trust her, and the answer was probably in the affirmative because she still definitely wanted to have sex with me. But in the end, it didn't matter if she kept quiet. All that mattered was what I would do, and I had about 6 weeks to realize that. I was suddenly old and very tired, and I needed to go to bed. I left the letter where it lay. I hadn't actually touched it for over 3 weeks. It just lay there like it was radioactive. Or maybe I was just afraid that I would have to come to terms with what it really meant. My life quickly returned to normal. I went to work, came home, ate, and went to bed. I never heard from Marcy again. I didn't hear from the kids either. That wasn't unusual because we'd raised them to be independent, able to fend for themselves. But I was a little surprised that Marcy hadn't asked them to check on me. Apparently, she really wanted her pass outside of our marriage. I had dinner with the Nielsen's. Vincent honored his offer to barbecue, and we had a pleasant evening. At first, we made mostly small talk on various meaningless topics, although I did ask them a couple of general questions about their lifestyle, but we pretty much left the subject alone. When we were alone, I asked Leslie if she'd heard anything about Marcy, and she said she hadn't. I believed her, but it seemed to me that Vincent was a little uncomfortable. So after dinner, when we were sitting outside having drinks, I was going to ask him directly about being uncomfortable, but he beat me to it. Rick, I want to tell you that I'm not comfortable with Leslie sleeping with you, and I want to withdraw my permission to do so. That got both Leslie's and my attention. He suggested we relax. It was obvious he hadn't talked to Leslie about it beforehand. Don't feel bad, Rick. She told me right away about her desire to be with you, and I know you are aware of our lifestyle and don't mind it. Leslie told me about your conversation last night, and frankly, I was more than a little upset about how Marcy felt about it. It may seem to you that our lifestyle is perverted, or at least abnormal, but we have certain rules, and they have to be followed to the letter. And rule number 1 is no cheating or peeping behind your partner's back. I think Marcy broke that rule. Remember, I had no idea she was leaving you for an extended period of time, so I want to make it clear to both of you that any sexual contact between the two of you I will consider as cheating. He looked at both of us carefully. Leslie looked disappointed, but nodded her head vigorously in agreement. I was beginning to like Mr. Vincent Nielsen. I'm very glad and grateful to hear you say that, Vinny. I've been trying to think of a way to say the same thing to both of you without hurting your feelings. As I told your wife, someday I'd like to talk more about your lifestyle. I admit to being somewhat fascinated by it. After that, we all had a very pleasant time that stretched into the night. I was thankful that I didn't have to go anywhere because I had too much to drink. As I left their house, Vinny shook my hand firmly and Leslie kissed me lightly on the cheek. They both offered to help me in any way they could. The truth is, I never saw either of them again. After being alone for an extended period of time, I became more aware of what I had put Marcy through during all those years I had been on deployment. Now I had to make all the decisions, pay all the bills, and deal with all the other myriad things associated with daily life. And unlike me, she had to deal with the kids. It must have been overwhelming for her at times, and she was right. I never expressed appreciation for what she did. Hell, I didn't appreciate her enough. And that might have been one of the reasons she did what she did. It was hard for me to get into a position of moral superiority with her, but my one affair, cut short years ago, hardly compared to what she was doing. On the other hand, did I really want to lose the 24 years of marriage I'd fought so hard for because of it? Before I knew it, more than 3 weeks had passed, and I was no closer to understanding what had happened, let alone making a decision. As the days went by, my anxiety grew because the day of decision was approaching. Either take me back or leave. These words repeated in my head over and over again, day and night. Finally, one night I decided to reread Marcy's letter. It was still lying on the kitchen table just as I'd left it. It seemed like an eternity ago. I filled a glass with ice cubes and poured my Glenlivet Code to the brim. This was going to be an emotional night. Taking the envelope, I made my way to my room, settled into a chair, pulled out the letter, and reread it once more. I had to refill my glass once because I reread it several times. I was glad it had been a while before I reacted to it. The first time I read it, I was just angry and missed so much meaning in its content. As I finished my second glass of whiskey, I realized what I had to do. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since Marcy had left. I was like that as soon as I made the decision. It drove my helicopter mates crazy that I could sleep so soundly just before a fight. I told them that once you have made all the plans and provided for all the contingencies, there is no point in worrying. From that point on, fate becomes the hunter. After I called Marcy and found her in Dr. Cardoza's room, I had no contact with her. The day Marcy's plane was scheduled to land, I checked her arrival time and went to the airport to be there when she got off. That's right, the airport. Either take me back or walk away. It wasn't happening. Sitting next to me in the passenger seat was Penny Washington's husband, Josh. I'm not sure he believed me when I retold him what Penny had told me, but I'd let him read Marcy's letter in my SUV on the way to the airport, and I could tell he was getting more excited by the minute. His doubts were slipping away, especially after he'd gotten a text from Penny before the plane left, telling him not to bother picking her up because Marcy was going to give her a ride home. How was she going to do that if she was supposed to be at the Ambassador Hotel? Maybe her boyfriend had made other arrangements. The 40-minute drive passed in silence. I reviewed my plans and made the appropriate arrangements. By the time we arrived at the airport, I was very worried about Josh and reminded him to keep his cool. He still had a chance at marriage. I also called the spouses of everyone on Marcy's team that I knew, gave them the information I had, and told them what time the plane was arriving. Interestingly, none of them were going to meet their spouse at the airport. Whatever they did with that information was up to them. I, on the other hand, had my own business to attend to. Josh and I had only been standing at the baggage claim for about 5 minutes when I saw Marcy and her team leaving the building. It couldn't have been better in my dreams. Since no one was expecting anyone to pick them up, everyone felt very comfortable with each other. The first person I noticed was Marcy. Dr. Cardoza had his arm over her shoulder and was nestled comfortably on her left breast. They looked very happy, and I guess they should be. The work they were doing was very important, and not without personal risk. It had been a long, grueling 6 weeks, and now they were returning to their normal, mundane routines. At that moment, I felt Josh swept past my shoulder, rushing towards the door. I noticed Penny encase him in a hug and kiss her boyfriend passionately. Nothing good would come of it. But I turned my attention to Marcy. At that moment, she saw Josh flying past her and looked in my direction as I approached her and the asshole doctor. The color disappeared from her face and she stopped, looking at me with her mouth open. I signaled, at which point my process server stepped toward her and said, "Are you Mrs. Mary Weston?" When she answered in the affirmative, he continued, "You have been served with a subpoena," and walked away. She started crying, but she was also very angry. By this time, her boyfriend realized what was going on, but was too shocked to react. I said to Marcy, "Did you really expect me to just take you back or walk away? Our 24-year marriage meant so little to you?" Admittedly, this caught me off guard, but without saying a word, she slapped me across the face with all her might. "You bastard! You ruined everything! Why couldn't you do what I said? You should have acted like a juvenile!" And she was about to throw another punch at me when I grabbed her arm. It was the moment I'd been waiting for. That's when Dr. Boytoy made his mistake. He grabbed my arm that was keeping Marcy from hitting me and tried to turn me around. All he got out was, "Listen, Rick," and he was already on the ground with his nose turned up, pouring blood all over his face and the ground. Marcy screamed and cried, then knelt down to give him a hand. I leaned over and whispered to him, "Listen, doctor, if you get up, I'll put you down again. If I ever see your ugly face again, I will end your surgical career. Do you understand me? Answer me, you bastard." Yes, I understand." He was having trouble speaking as he spit out blood and teeth. Marcy was sobbing, hyperventilating. Shooting daggers of eyes at me, she shrilled, "Are you happy now?" I noticed the commotion around us, but assumed it had to do with me putting Dr. Cardoza down, but looking around, I noticed Penny screaming and trying to pull Josh away from her boy. Josh was holding his head, grabbing his hair with both hands. He was angrily banging the already unconscious man's head against the concrete, saying something unintelligible. But that wasn't the only thing going on. There were people running everywhere, sirens blaring. I noticed fists flying around us, hair pulling, yelling, etc. No one was even paying attention to our little drama of 3 people. Apparently, many of the people I called had already arrived, and they weren't thrilled. Most of Marcy's nurses were younger and had kids at home. It wasn't pretty. Apparently, I was the only one whose wife had set him up with a woman before he left. I looked at Marcy again, smiled, and said, "Yeah, I'm happy," and started to walk away. She plopped down on the ground and through tears asked me, What am I supposed to do now? Well, you have a room at the Ambassador. I suggest you use it. I didn't wait for Josh because I knew he wouldn't need a ride. He could have killed his wife's lover. He was in deep shit as dozens of police officers were arriving on all sides. I turned to Marcy again. One more thing. I didn't contact Kyle and Mary to warn them. I'm giving you 48 hours to do that. If you don't talk to them in that time, I'll call them and let them know what's going on. If I hear from them first, and the first words out of their mouths aren't something like, "Dad, I know Mom cheated, but..." I'll leave. Is that clear? She just nodded her head in between tears. I heard from both kids 2 days later and couldn't be happier for them. Mary called first and said, "Daddy, I'm so sorry. Mom told me what she did, but I understand it's between you and her. I'm not going to get involved, and will just say that I love you both and hope you can find the best solution for each of you." Kyle's call was pretty much the same, only he added that the news had reported a major disturbance at Terminal 7 a couple days ago, and that additional police forces were needed to deal with it. "You didn't have anything to do with that, did you?" "Okay, Kyle." I hung up the phone, smiling. Our divorce was finalized 4 months later. We split everything 50-50, sold the house, and left each other's pensions. Marcy didn't contest it, but wanted one last meeting before signing the final papers. I refused and told my attorney that I had nothing to say to her and was not interested in hearing what she had to say. Either sign the papers or don't. 2 months later, I got a transfer to the West Coast through my company. I wanted to get as far away from home as possible and leave my past behind. As time went on, I began to regret more and more my actions that day at the airport. The sensible thing to do would have been to simply ask Marcy to serve me at the hotel and move on with my life. But I just couldn't get over the disrespect Marcy had shown me and our marriage through her actions, and especially her letter. Of all the things she did and said, the thing that upset me the most was that in the letter she said not to make a scene. She knew what my reaction would be. She knew her marriage was over the day she left, but she left anyway. I kept in touch with current events at home mostly through Kyle, but also through friends I had at work. I didn't pressure anyone, but I didn't stop them from giving me information either. I assumed that Marcy would marry Dr. Olu after our divorce was finalized, but that didn't happen. In fact, he broke up with Marcy the same week they returned from South America. I never realized if it was because of what I told him or if he was just tired of being with an older woman. Last I heard, someone said it sounded like he'd married a 20-year-old candy striper. Marcy went back to work at the same hospital and, as far as I knew, was as competent a surgical team leader as ever. Kyle once told me that she had been seeing someone, but nothing serious had happened, and, like me, she was just head over heels in her work. The final list of events that happened that day, which was dubbed the Terminal 7 Massacre in the local press, is quite long. There were 6 divorces, 3 jail sentences, 4 lawsuits, and a slew of misdemeanor fines. There were also hospital bills for broken bones, cuts and bruises, black eyes, a few stitches, and other injuries. The worst I felt, of course, was Josh. He had actually almost killed Penny's lover. He suffered permanent brain damage and will need assistance for the rest of his life. Josh also received 10 years in prison. What happened to Penny? Nothing. She divorced Josh and went back to work for Marcy. If I'd just done what Marcy wanted, Josh would probably still be divorced, but he would be a free man. Josh communicates with me periodically via email. There's email in prison. Thankfully, he doesn't blame me for his problems and takes full responsibility for his actions, but it still haunts me. Incredibly, I have never been visited by any law enforcement officer. A few weeks after the incident, I noticed that a "for sale" sign had appeared in the yard of Vincent and Leslie's house. Less than 2 months later, a new family moved into the house. I heard they divorced a couple years later. It wasn't anything serious. They just got fed up with each other. I later read that couples with open marriages are the only group that has a higher divorce rate than military and medical personnel. 2 years after our divorce, Mary graduated from the Navy. She loved her job, but she wanted a family even more, and she knew better than anyone the dangers of married life in the military. She married a very nice guy, and they just informed me that they are pregnant with my first grandchild. She still works for an aerospace company and loves what she does. 4 years after the divorce. Believe it or not, my ex-wife and I managed to sit through 2.5 hours of our son Kyle's college graduation ceremony together without killing each other. He had a bachelor's degree in aeronautics and planned to pursue a career in the Air Force. Of course, things got a little more complicated at the reception we paid for afterward. After we had a couple drinks each, Marcy decided that now would be a good time to talk about what I had given up at the last divorce hearing. She found me outside sitting alone at a table overlooking a large pond with small sailboats on it. "We can talk, Rick. I have something to say." Still looking at the water, I gestured for her to sit down and said rather wistfully, "You know, Marcy, I think I might learn to sail someday. It looks incredibly peaceful. I need to find more peace in my life." "No wonder, since you ruined all families with your antics at the airport. I'll never forgive you for that, Rick." Although I agreed with her in some ways, I still didn't like her attitude. "Look, Marcy, it's all in the past, but I'd really like to know. What exactly did you do 2 hours before your shift started each day while you were standing in the parking lot at the Red Roof Inn? I mean, I'm just wondering how far your hypocrisy goes." She was silent for a very long time and replied without answering my question. "I think it's best to let bygones be bygones." I noticed that tears appeared in her eyes. "Our first grandchild is coming any day now, and I think we should be able to behave maturely enough together to not embarrass our children." "Yes, Marcy, I think we can do that. After all, we spent the whole day together and didn't hit each other once." She only smiled sadly, and we sat in silence, looking out at the water and watching the approaching sunset.